If what's happening in Sudan was not happening in Africa, would we be paying attention? I think about that a lot. If millions were being bombed in their own capital, if hospitals were looted, if children were starving, if women were being assaulted while fetching food, and it wasn't in Africa, would the world still be this silent? Because deep down, I think we all know the answer. If this were happening in Europe, in the Middle East, anywhere else, the response would look completely different. Like there'd be breaking headlines, people posting flags in their bios, emergency fundraisers, politicians just scrambling to say the right thing. But when it's African, when it's black, silence feels justified. And I don't think that silence is a coincidence. I think it's a result of conditioning. Because somewhere along the way, the world learned to see African pain as normal, background noise instead of breaking news. The same images that would spark outrage anywhere else just blend into the feed when they're African. We've been taught for generations to look at suffering on the continent and say, quote unquote, that's how it is. And when something becomes predictable, it stops being tragic. It just becomes tolerated. That's the quiet cruelty of it all, because it's not that people do not care. It's that they've been trained to care selectively, to feel grief only when it's familiar, empathy only when it's comfortable, outrage only when it's fashionable. We live in a world where empathy has a hierarchy, where proximity decides who deserves compassion, and where the algorithm decides who deserves humanity. And that's what breaks me, because it's not the world doesn't see Sudan. It's just that it doesn't feel it. And that distance between seeing and feeling is where apathy grows. But let's be real, it's not just the world, it's us too. We've mistaken awareness for action. We share a post and feel like we've done enough. We scroll, we care for a second, and then we move on. Social media has made it so easy to appear conscious without actually being connected. We confuse noise for knowledge, engagement for empathy, and visibility for value, and Sudan has paid the price for that illusion. For those of us in the diaspora, I feel like this is more personal. It should hit us even deeper because we're close enough to understand, but at the same time, we're far enough to look away. We also, hypocritically, I'm not gonna lie, celebrate African pride when it's convenient. The music, the culture, the arts, but we become completely silent when it's grief. And we love Africa's joy, but we fear her suffering. And that disconnection didn't happen by accident. I want you to know that. It was designed. We were raised to chase comfort, not consciousness, to assimilate, not empathize. But if we only love the culture and we ignore the crises, then what are we really proud of? And this silence, this hesitation that we have to speak is something we all have to confront. But the world wants us to be silent because silence is a kind of agreement. Every time someone says, "Oh, I don't know enough to talk about Sudan," that uncertainty becomes permission for injustice to continue unnoticed. The truth is, none of us were born knowing, but the willingness to learn is what separates bystanders from witnesses. Silence is not neutrality, it's participation. And that silence is fueled by something bigger, a system that decides whose pain is profitable. Western media controls the narrative of tragedy. Did you know that? And Africa rarely makes the cut. Did you know that? Right? Because African stories don't sell sympathy. They challenge the myth of progress. We've been told for so long that Africa is chaos, that when chaos happens, it doesn't shock anyone. That's how you erase empathy, by making suffering look inevitable. It's why people say, "Oh, it's always like this." But that's not the truth. That's fatigue disguised as fact. We've been conditioned to believe Africa is doomed, when in reality, it's been fighting for centuries to prove it's not. Hopelessness isn't heritage, it's programming. And every time we refuse to believe that, we break the cycle. And that's where responsibility comes in, because once you learn, once you truly understand what's happening, you cannot unknow it. Knowledge isn't just information, it's accountability. And when you know, silence becomes a choice. And every choice either sustains the world as it is or pushes it towards what it could be. That's what this moment demands of us, to reclaim empathy as something radical, to care loudly, consistently, unapologetically, to remember that the fight for Sudan isn't just about one country. It's about redefining what it means to be human in the world that keeps forgetting. And I think that's what makes this generation different. We are the first with the power to document, to share, to amplify in real time. We are the media now. What we choose to remember, what we choose to repost, what we choose to care about, it shapes the moral memory of the world. We are the first generation that can rewrite the narrative as it unfolds, and maybe the last that can afford not to. And maybe, just maybe, there's something spiritual about that. Because our ancestors fought for liberation without microphones, without platforms, without followers. They risk their lives for voices we take for granted. So if they can face bullets for freedom, surely we can face discomfort for truth. Our empathy is their legacy, and indifference would be their betrayal. So if you're here right now, it's not by accident. You clicked on this episode because somewhere inside you wanted to understand. And that's where everything begins, with knowledge. Because understanding isn't passive. We talked about this. It's power, right? And in a world that's been built on misunderstanding Africa, choosing to learn is one of the most revolutionary things you can do at this current moment in time. So this is They Lied About Africa. And today we're talking about Sudan, not just as an abstract crisis, but as a mirror of our collective conscience. And in this episode, I'm going to unpack how we got here. So we're going to talk about Sudan's geography, ancient civilizations, to colonization, to dictatorship, to the war that is happening right now as of October 25th, 2025. Okay? Each segment is designed to make sense of history. I want it to connect to today and remind us what's at stake, not just for Sudan, but for all of us. Because this isn't just about Sudan's story, it's about the world's memory and how easy it is to forget people who look like us until we remind them that we're still here. You know, before we even get into who fought who or which general is in power, we have to start with where Sudan actually is, because when you look at Sudan on a map, you start to understand everything else. So this country sits right between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa is the belt above the Sahara, so think like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, while Sub-Saharan is everything south of the desert, so Central, East, and Southern Africa. To its north is Egypt and the Mediterranean world, and to its south are the grasslands that stretch into the heart of Sub-Saharan. And to the east, the Red Sea, basically a highway between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, where pilgrims and merchants have crossed for centuries carrying ideas, goods, and faith. It's a country literally built at a crossroads, if by the way you hear me describing it, right? And crossroads can be powerful, but they can also be a little exhausting. And Sudan has always been both bridge and battleground, a meeting point between civilizations that didn't always understand each other. So before 2011, which was the year South Sudan gained independence after decades of civil war and a peace deal, which we'll get into later, Sudan was the largest country on the African continent, stretching from desert to rainforest. So if you trace the Nile down, you'll see something beautiful. Two great rivers, the White Nile coming from the Great Lakes region, that's Uganda and Rwanda, with Lakes Victoria and Albert feeding the river, and the Blue Nile flowing out of the Ethiopian highlands, which are those elevated plateaus in Ethiopia where heavy rains swell the river, meet right in Khartoum, Sudan's capital city, literally built where two rivers become one. That meeting point, the confluence, is more than just a geographical fact. It's the story of Sudan itself, two worlds colliding to create something new and sometimes something unstable. So the Nile isn't just water, okay? It's survival. It fed agriculture, trade, and entire civilizations. And because the Nile flows north into Egypt, whoever controlled its source, the upper reaches where it begins and thus controls of farms and cities downstream, controlled power. That's why Egypt and later Britain became obsessed with Sudan. For Egypt, it was about water security, and for Britain, about empire and the Nile itself, which we'll also unpack later, okay? So you control the Nile, you control the heart of the region, and that's where identity comes in, okay? So now I want to talk about Sudan's culture. So culturally, and this is a complicated thing, and people have their opinions about the terms I'm going to bring up and things of that sort, but fight with yourself, okay? I'm just going to tell you what I read and what I know, okay? Culturally, Sudan is complicated, and I say that with love from what I understand, but in the north, okay, the religion of Islam spread early through trade routes and intermarriage. So we're talking like medieval centuries, well before Europeans arrived, through merchants, scholars, and families, not conquest, okay? Now, by around the 14th century, many northern kingdoms, think the late Nubian states that blended Islamic learning with local customs, had adopted Islam not through invasion, but through centuries of exchange and pilgrimage that blended Arab and African tradition. Arabic became not just a language, but a marker of identity and status. Meanwhile, the southern regions developed differently, so they were connected to African kingdoms further inland with diverse religions, languages, and customs. So Sudan became both Arab and African, both desert and savanna. And the duality isn't something to fix, okay? It's something that we need to understand because for centuries, people moved freely between those identities without seeing them as contradictions. It wasn't until outsiders, the first Ottoman Egyptian rulers, then the British, decided that one side was quote unquote civilized and the other was quote unquote backward, that this balance broke. And if identity shaped culture, water shaped politics. So Egypt's entire existence, like I said, depended on that river. So when Egyptian rulers under the Ottoman Empire looked south in the 1800s, they didn't just see land, they saw control, okay? Control of the Nile meant control of life itself. And that obsession is what led them to conquer Sudan in the first place, starting in the 1820s when Egypt itself was under Ottoman authority and its governor, Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, was building one of the region's strongest armies, an imperial ambition that would soon pull Sudan into empire. And from that point on, Sudan stopped being seen as a living, breathing civilization and started being seen as a resource. Its people enslaved as soldiers and labor, its gold and taxes extracted, its river treated as a strategic asset. But here's what I think often gets lost. Sudan wasn't some empty land waiting to be claimed. It was home to people, many peoples. You had Nubians in the north, ancient Nile communities, Beja along the Red Sea coast, Fur communities in Darfur, the far west bordering Chad, and Dinka Inura people in the south, all trading, intermarrying, and living side by side. So ethnic diversity was not the issue. It was how outsiders governed that diversity. Colonial administrators and later regimes playing favorites, sending resources and power to some regions over others, that turned it into conflict. So Sudan's story is a reminder that difference isn't dangerous until power makes it so. So when we talk about Sudan today, the wars, the revolutions, the coups, we're really talking about what happens when a country that was once a cultural crossroads becomes a political chessboard. Its geography made it valuable, its diversity made it resilient. But those same traits also made it vulnerable to empire. And that's where we'll go next, because before colonizers drew borders, specifically the Anglo-Egyptian arrangement where Britain and Egypt ruled together from 1899 to 1956, before Britain and Egypt fought for control, Sudan already had kingdoms, faiths, and civilizations of its own, from Kush to Meroe to Islamic sultanates like Sennar. And understanding those is how we understand what was lost and what might still be rebuilt. So now, before foreign powers ever set foot in Sudan, powerful kingdoms have already risen and fallen along the Nile. And this land wasn't a blank state. It was the center of civilization. So thousands of years ago, the kingdom of Kush, which by the way, I have a whole episode on, ruled from cities like Napata and Meroe, building pyramids and even conquering Egypt around 750 BCE. They actually have more pyramids than Egypt. Fun fact. And they had their own writing, their own gods, and a trade network stretching deep into Africa. So when we talk about pharaohs, remember, some of them were Sudanese, okay? Now, centuries later, as Kush declined, new Christian Nubian kingdoms emerged, places like Makuria and Alodia, painting churches with bright murals of saints and negotiating peace with early Muslim Egypt through a long-lasting treaty. For almost 700 years, Sudan balanced worlds, Christian and Muslim, desert and river, through trade, not war. Then slowly the balance shifted. So by the 13th century, Islam was spreading south through merchants and scholars, again, not armies or some sort of a conquest. Okay? Northern rulers began to convert, Arabic mixed with local languages, and new Islamic states appeared, most famously the Fungi Sultanate of Sennar around 1504. It became a crossroads for gold, ivory, and ideas, connecting the Red Sea to the heart of Africa. Out west, the Darfur Sultanate thrived as another independent Muslim kingdom trading with Egypt in the Sahel. And by the 1600s, Sudan was a web thriving of African Islamic states linked to the wider world. But those same trade routes that once carried scholars and pilgrims soon carried soldiers, okay? As Egypt rose under the Ottoman Empire, it looked south towards Sudan's wealth and its waters. That moment in the 1820s marks the start of foreign conquest, and that's where the story turns next. So by the early 1800s, the balance of power in the Nile Valley had changed. So Egypt, once part of the Ottoman Empire, was now ruled by an ambitious governor named Muhammad Ali Pasha, a 19th century military ruler determined to build his own empire. On paper, he still answered to the Ottoman Sultan, but in practice, he was carving out a dynasty that would control Egypt for generations. So, why did Egypt look south? Two words: power and resources. We talked about this. Egypt's entire life depended on the Nile, and Muhammad Ali wanted to control it from its source. He also wanted soldiers for his new army and wealth to fund his expansion. And Sudan, with its gold, gum, Arabic, and people, looked like the new perfect target, okay? In 1820, he sent his own son, Ismail Pasha, down the Nile with a modern army armed with cannons and rifles, and one by one, Sudan's kingdoms fell. By 1824, Egypt had conquered most of northern and central Sudan, marking the start of what historians call the Turco-Egyptian period, which is a mix of Ottoman and Egyptian control. At first, Cairo claimed it was bringing order and civilization, but for most Sudanese, it meant heavy taxes, forced labor, and slave raids that reached deep into the south and west. The new rulers built the city of Khartoum, where the two Niles meet, as we talked about earlier, with Sudan's modern-day geography, as their administrative capital became a trade hub. And it became a city of contrast. So you had merchants and soldiers prospering while local communities lost their land, autonomy, and peace. And over time, resentment began to grow within the communities, right? Sudanese leaders saw Egyptian officials enriching themselves, and communities in the south and west faced brutal slave raiding campaigns. And then you had Islamic scholars, tribal leaders, and peasants alike began to ask why this was truly the rule of the fellow Muslims or just another empire in disguise. Those questions would eventually spark a revolution, one led by a man who called himself the Mahdi, or quote unquote, the guided one. And his uprising would not just shake Egypt, but the British Empire itself. So by the late 1800s, Sudan was boiling, right? So we have decades of Turco-Egyptian rule that had drained the country, heavy taxes, slave raids, corruption, and foreign officials who treated Sudanese people like subjects, not citizens. And faith and dignity were the only things many communities had left. And then that's when a man named Muhammad Ahmad stepped forward. He was a young religious scholar from an island in the Nile. And in 1881, he declared himself the Mahdi, meaning the guided one, a prophesied leader in Islam who would restore justice and true faith. And to ordinary Sudanese, he wasn't just preaching religion, he was offering liberation, right? Considering everything that they were going through, that's all they wanted. People across the country, right? Farmers, tribes, traders, and even former soldiers, they rallied behind him. They saw his message as an end to exploitation by both Egyptian rulers and the foreign powers behind them. His movement became known as the Mahdiya, or the Mahidist Revolution. At first, Cairo and its British advisors dismissed him as a ordinary rebel, right? But the Mahdi forces, who fought mostly with spears and faith, began defeating Egyptian armies one after another. And by 1885, they captured Khartoum, Sudan's capital, right? The Egyptian British commander there, his name was General Charles Gordon, he was killed. And for the first time in decades, Sudan was independent. The Mahdi ruled only briefly before dying that same year, but his successor, Khalifa Abdullahi, kept the movement alive. They built an Islamic state centered in the Durman across the river from Khartoum. It wasn't perfect, okay? They had like internal struggles, and famine also tested the new regime. But for many Sudanese people, it represented pride and self-rule after generations of outside control. And meanwhile, Britain, humiliated by the fall of Khartoum, never forgot, okay? They held on to that grudge. And as the 1890s approach, British forces prepared a massive return campaign determined to reclaim Sudan and reopen the Nile route. And in 1898, British and Egyptian troops under General Herbert Kitchener crushed the Mahidist army at the Battle of Omdurman, using modern machine guns and artillery. So you already know they was cooked, okay? Tens of thousands of Mahidist fighters were killed in a single day. Sudan was once again brought under foreign control, and this time jointly ruled by Britain and Egypt under what they called the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. The dream of an independent Islamic Sudan had been crushed, but its memory endured, a symbol of resistance that would echo through every uprising that came after. So after the Mahidist state fell in 1898, Sudan didn't regain peace. It just traded one ruler for another. Britain and Egypt signed an agreement in 1899 to govern the country together, calling it the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, basically meaning joint rule. And in reality, Britain held the power. Egypt was just more of a junior partner. And for Britain, Sudan wasn't just another colony. It was a link in the chain of empire. Controlling Sudan meant controlling the Nile, protecting Suez Canal, and keeping a corridor open between Egypt and Britain's other territories in East Africa and India. It was strategic geography disguised as civilization. So Egypt had its own reasons to stay involved. It still saw the Nile as its lifeline and wanted influence over its southern neighbor. So while the world called it quote unquote joint administration, for Sudanese people it felt like double colonization. So British authority backed by Egyptian bureaucracy. And in order to manage this vast territory, Britain applied its classic divide and rule approach. The northern regions, mostly Muslim and Arabic speaking, received schools, railways, and administrative attention. To the south, which was home to dozens of non-Arab, non-Muslim communities, was deliberately isolated. British officers banned Arabic in southern schools, restricted northern merchants from traveling there, and encouraged Christian missions instead. The goal was not development, it was separation, obviously, right? And by keeping North and South apart, Britain could prevent a unified Sudanese identity from ever forming. Even within the North, power was concentrated in Khartoum, while places like Darfur and the eastern Beja lands were neglected or tightly controlled through local chiefs. That's how inequality became baked into the country's geography, a legacy that still shapes Sudan today. So I know that was a lot, right? We talked about all those kingdoms, empires, conquests, and revolutions, and there's honestly so much more to learn about those things. Actually, if you are interested in learning more about those specific things that we just mentioned, if you are listening via audio only, in the show notes I will have a link to my link tree, and within my link tree you can find all my sources that I used to combine this episode, and hopefully that will bring you down some sort of a rabbit hole and will allow you to put the pieces together more for yourself or fill in any gaps that you may have about this issue. But it's important that we touched on all of that first, because everything that came before 1956 explains everything that comes after. Because the British didn't rule Sudan. They rewired it. And they didn't just split the country north and south. They educated people in different languages, and they gave power to one region while isolating the other. So it wasn't just colonization, it was social engineering. So when independence finally came, Sudan wasn't starting from scratch, it was starting from imbalance. And that's why this part matters, because when we talk about independence, we usually imagine celebration and unity. But for Sudan, freedom came with the question, could a country so divided by others actually hold itself together? Because the next decades, the civil wars, the coups, and even the eventual split of South Sudan all trace back to this moment. So when Sudan finally became independent in 1956, the atmosphere was electric. There was people pouring into the streets of Khartoum, waving flags, singing, celebrating the end of almost 60 years of foreign rule. And for the first time in generations, Sudan belonged to itself. But independence didn't erase the colonial map, it centered it. Sudan inherited two very different worlds under one flag: a north, mostly Arab and Muslim, closely tied to Egypt and the Middle East, and a south, which was African, multilingual, home to Christians and traditional faiths, rooted in East Africa. Each region had been taught different histories, governed by different laws, even used different administrative systems. So unity wasn't natural, it was fragile, something that would need constant care. And in the early years, power rested mostly with northern political parties and elites who spoke Arabic and saw themselves as the natural leaders of an Islamic nation. And the southern leaders wanted something else. They wanted a federal system, local autonomy, and real inclusion. But when their concerns were ignored, resentment obviously grew really fast. So even before independence was officially declared, Southern soldiers in the army rebelled in 1955, refusing orders from Northern officers. That single act triggered the First Sudanese Civil War, a conflict that dragged on for 17 years, y'all, and it ended in 1972 with the Addis Ababa Agreement, which gave the South limited self-rule. And for a brief moment, it looked like the wounds might start to heal. But peace in Sudan just never seemed to last, because a decade later, President Jafar Nimiri imposed Islamic law, or Sharia law, across the entire country in 1983, dissolving that autonomy. And for many in the South, this wasn't just about politics. It literally felt like they were being erased. It was erasure. So rebellion broke out again. And this time, Southern forces reorganized as the SPLA, or the Sudan People's Liberation Army, led by a charismatic commander named John Garang. Now, here's something people often get wrong. Garang wasn't fighting only for Southern separation. His vision was something he called a quote-unquote new Sudan, a country where every region, every religion, every ethnicity could stand as equals. But decades of mistrust, exhaustion, and violence made that dream almost impossible to realize. The new war, which was the second Sudanese civil war, was even longer and bloodier than the first. And it wasn't just about religion. In the 1970s, Sudan discovered oil, mostly in the south, but the pipelines, refineries, and export terminals were all in the north. So while Khartoum collected the profits, southern communities carried the cost, fighting, displacement, and poverty. And by the late 1980s, famine and war had devastated millions of people. And it wasn't only an internal conflict, the Cold War made it worse. The North received weapons and aid from Arab allies and at times Soviet suppliers. The South found sympathy and limited support from neighboring African states, and some Western circles saw it as an anti-communist or Christian struggle. So even peace in Sudan wasn't fully Sudan's to decide. The world's rival powers were quietly shaping it too. So by the end of the 1980s, the country was falling apart. You had prices skyrocketing, food was scarce, and the war had drained the economy dry. Democracy collapsed again and again. 3 military coups since independence, all promising order and reform, all ending chaos. So when an army officer named Omar al-Bashir, backed by an Islamic thinker, Hassan al-Turabi, seized power in 1989, many people didn't resist. They were exhausted. Bashir promised stability, Islamic values, and an end to the endless war. And at first, that promise sounded like relief, but what followed was not unity. It was 3 decades of authoritarian rule that would deepen the cracks already splitting Sudan apart. And in that promise of stability, that's where the next chapter begins, because Bashir's Sudan wouldn't just face internal war. It would face genocide in Darfur, global isolation, and eventually the birth of a brand new nation, South Sudan. The same divisions colonialism planted and independence failed to heal we're about to erupt again on a global stage. So I hope you're understanding now why I brought up all of those things that happened in the past about Sudan's colonization and empires and things of that sort. We need to understand how Sudan looked like before any external players were involved, right? Africa in general, or any country that is going through some sort of conflict, is not naturally the way that it is. There are stories involved. There are factors to consider. And I hope that helps you put the pieces together for why Sudan is essentially the way that it is right now. So by the time we get to 1989, right, Sudan has already been through everything. We have colonization, independence, 2 civil wars, endless coups. The country is literally exhausted, and people are so tired of instability, tired of governments that promise democracy but collapse before they can even deliver bread. And that's when an army officer named Omar al-Bashir steps in. He leads a military coup and seizes power, backed by an influential Islamist scholar named Hassan al-Turabi. And they claim they're going to rebuild Sudan, restore morality, discipline, and faith. And at first, after decades of chaos, a lot of Sudanese just sigh in relief. They're not cheering exactly, but they're too worn down to resist. Bashir's rise feels like a reset, but it's actually the beginning of one of the longest and most repressive regimes in modern African history. So here's what happens next. Turabi, the thinker behind the scenes, dreams of turning Sudan into a model Islamic state, not just in religion, but in law, culture, and politics. And by the early 1990s, Bashir's government imposes strict Sharia law, expands Islamic education, and builds what he calls an Islamic civilization project. It sounds righteous on paper, but in practice, it becomes a political tool. Yeah. Loyalty disguised as faith. You had public employees who were purged for not conforming, and women who were facing new dress codes and moral policing, and then journalists were being arrested, and anyone seen as opposing the government is labeled as an infidel or a traitor. And Sudan, which was already fragile, by the way, becomes even more polarized. And the South, mostly Christian and traditional faith communities, see this as a declaration of war on their identity. The Second Sudanese Civil War, which had already begun raging since 1983, only deepens. But something else happens in the 90s that a few saw coming. Bashir's Sudan becomes a global pariah. Turabi opens the country's doors to radical Islamist movements. Figures like Osama bin Laden live and do business in Khartoum for several years. Sudan becomes a hub for extremist and anti-Western rhetoric, and the United States places it on its state sponsors of terrorism list in 1993. International sanctions isolate the economy. So now you have war in the south, repression at home, and economic isolation from abroad. Yet the regime survives, not because it's loved, but because it's learned how to manipulate every system of survival. Then by the early 2000s, another crisis explodes, this time in the western region of Darfur. It's a place that had always been marginalized, mostly populated by Black African Muslim communities like Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa. For decades, they've been excluded from development while Arabized groups were favored. In 2003, rebel groups in Darfur rise up against Khartoum, accusing the government of discrimination. Bashir's regime responds brutally, and instead of addressing their grievances, it arms local militias, the Janjaweed, who burn villages. They kill civilians and they displace millions. It becomes one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. And by 2004, the world starts calling it what it is, genocide. And for the first time, the international community actually takes real legal action. In 2009, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, they issued an arrest warrant for Omar al-Bashir, charging him with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Think about that. A sitting head of state indicted by the ICC while still in power. That's how deep the cracks have become, y'all. But while Darfur burns, another political track is underway. So after decades of fighting, the government in Khartoum and the Sudan's People Liberation Movement, which is the SPLM, in the South region, signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, in 2005. It's meant to end Africa's longest civil war, and the deal promises South autonomy, power sharing, and most importantly, referendum to decide whether it wants to stay part of Sudan or become independent. And that's historic. And for 6 years, the country holds its breath. Then, in 2011, the vote happens and almost 99% of Sudanese vote for independence. Sudan splits into two. It is very emotional, and people are crying with pride at this current moment in time, and others are also just heartbroken. And after 50 years of war, the South finally gains freedom. But the North loses more than just a region. It loses most of its oil. And suddenly Khartoum, which had built its economy around that revenue, collapses into financial crisis. So now Bashir's government is isolated, broke, and under sanctions. Darfur remains unresolved. The East feels forgotten. And the rest of the country, especially young people, feel trapped in a future they did not choose. Now, by the end of the 2000s, Bashir has turns survival into strategy. He holds fake elections, reshuffles allies, and silences dissent. He uses religion to justify control and nationalism to suppress rebellion. But underneath that surface, Sudanese society is shifting. New generations are growing up with, you can imagine, satellite, TV, social media, music, and global awareness. They're connected to the world in a way their parents never were. And they're starting to ask the most dangerous question an authoritarian state can face. Why are we still living like this? No, seriously, why are we still living like this? That question is the spark that lights the next revolution. And that's where we will go next, into the streets of Khartoum, where young people, women, and workers rise up to reclaim a voice they were never meant to have. So by the time we reach 2018, Sudan has been under Omar al-Bashir's rule for almost 30 years. 3 decades of corruption, censorship, wars, and broken promises. 3 decades of people learning how to survive under silence. But silence is like pressure. It builds. And in Sudan, it finally exploded. It all started with bread. Yes, bread. In December 2018, the government tripled the price of basic goods. Bread, fuel, cooking oil overnight. And in a country where many families already lived on the edge, that was it. That was their last straw. People took this to the streets of the city of Atbara, a place known as the railway town, the beating heart of Sudan's working class. And at first, it was about the economy. But as the protests spread from Atbara to Khartoum and beyond, the message changed. People started chanting, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Taskat Bas, meaning just fall, that's all. So those words, as you can imagine, echoed through neighborhoods, mosques, schools, markets, and suddenly something new was happening. People who had grown up afraid to speak were now shouting with their full chest. And you know what's powerful about this moment? It wasn't politicians or generals leading this revolution. It was women. It was students. It was the youth. Women like Ala Salah, standing on cars in her white thobe, leading chants in front of thousands, her voice cutting through decades of silence. Students from universities, young professionals, teachers, doctors, they were all organizing through networks like the Sudanese Professionals Association, otherwise known as the SPA. Social media was playing also a huge role. It wasn't just for connection anymore. It was for coordination. Protest routes, safe houses, medical aid, everything was communicated through WhatsApp and Facebook. And yet, what really held it together was something much older: community. Neighbors cooked for each other. Strangers started protecting one another. Mosques became clinics. Homes became hideouts. The revolution wasn't just in the streets, it was in people's hearts. And by April 2019, after months of massive demonstrations and violent crackdowns, the unthinkable happened. Omar al-Bashir was removed from power. 30 years gone overnight. For the first time, people dared to dream. Tears, music, chants, flags. Sudan was alive again. It wasn't just a political shift, it felt spiritual, because when you spent your entire life under dictatorship, hope itself becomes an act of resistance. And after Bashir's fall, a power-sharing deal was formed between military and civilian leaders, so a transition government meant to guide Sudan towards democracy. The man leading the civilian side was Abdullah Hamdok, an economist respected both at home and abroad. He represented reason, competence, and possibility. For a while, people began to breathe again. Sudan was removed from the US terrorism list. International aid started flowing. Music returned to the air, art to the walls, and the streets felt like they belonged to the people again. There was a sense of maybe, finally, the revolution had won. But here's the thing about revolutions, they're not moments, they're processes, and the old powers never really leave quietly. So in October 2021, just 2 years after Bashir's fall, the military, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, staged another coup. They arrested Hamdok, dissolved the transitional government, and reinstated military control. Protests erupted again across the country, thousands marching despite tear gas, bullets, and arrests. And it wasn't just anger, it was heartbreak. People felt robbed of a future they already tasted. And it wasn't just politics, it was also trauma. While all this was happening, another man's power was quietly rising out of the shadows. Mohammed Hamadan Daglo, other known as Hemeti, the commander of the Rapid Support Forces, otherwise known as the RSF. He was once a militia defender from Darfur, a man who fought for Bashir, then turned against him, and now he stood side by side with Burhan for the moment. So when people call what happened in 2019 a revolution, I think they're right, but only halfway, because revolutions don't end with when a dictator falls. They end when a system changes. And in Sudan, that system never did. That's why when the next war breaks out, the one we're about to talk about, it feels like deja vu. Different faces, same structures, different uniforms, same logics, different slogans, same pain, y'all. But still, the people, eventually the youth, kept showing up. Even in exile, even online, even in whispers, the spirit of that revolution hasn't died. And that, to me, says everything about Sudanese resilience. They didn't just demand freedom, they became it. So after Bashir's fall and the revolution's brief hope, Sudan entered a new chapter that felt both familiar and foreign. The generals were back, but this time there was two. And what started as a fragile power-sharing agreement would soon become one of the most deadliest wars in the world. So on one side was the Sudanese armed forces, as we mentioned earlier, the SAF, the state's traditional army. It's the old guard, the formal military Sudan inherited after independence in 1956. It came straight out of colonial command structures with disciplined uniforms, hierarchy, and deep roots in Arab-dominated North. The SAF has always seen itself as the rightful protector of the state, the symbol of sovereignty and order, but it's also the same army that carried out coups, crushed dissent, and ruled over the country for decades. Then, on the other side, the Rapid Support Forces, otherwise known as the RSF, Sudan's shadow army. It started out as Janjaweed militias in the early 2000s, armed by Bashir to fight rebels in Darfur. They committed atrocities the world still hasn't fully reckoned with: massacres, mass grapes, burned villages. And when the world began to notice, Bashir rebranded them in 2013 as the Rapid Support Forces to make them look legitimate. Their leader, Mohammed Hamadan Dagalo, or Hemeti, came from outside the elite, a camel trader from one of many Darfur's tribes who fought his way into power. Under him, the RSF became rich through global mining, smuggling, and mercenary work for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Yemen. And by 2019, they were more than a militia. They were a business empire with an army attached. So when Bashir fell, two men stepped into the vacuum: General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of the SAF and Hemeti of the RSF. They presented themselves as partners of the revolution, promising to protect Sudan's transition to democracy. But let's be honest, they were never partners. They were two predators circling the same carcass of power. Burhan represented the old Sudan, the institutional military backed by Egypt and nostalgic for control, and Hemeti represented the new Sudan, informal, fueled by gold and Gulf money, built on the logic of militias and cash. Their relationship was uneasy from day one. And then came the question that lit the fuse: how and when should the RSF be merged into the regular army? Burhan wanted it done in 2 years. Hemeti wanted 10. But because once the RSF merged, he'd lose everything: his independence, his business, his soldiers, his leverage. And rather than compromise, both men prepared for war. So on a quiet Saturday morning, Khartoum woke up to explosions. People thought it was thunder at first, actually, until fighter jets screamed overhead and windows shattered. The SAF and the RSF had turned on each other, and the capital, the heart of Sudan, became a war zone. And for decades, war in Sudan has always been out there, in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, far from Khartoum's cafes and schools. But this time, it came home. And by May, Khartoum was unrecognizable, a city of smoke. And over 10 million Sudanese have been displaced, the highest number anywhere in the world right now. And yet, despite that staggering figure, global attention faded maybe after a few weeks. And while the fighting rages, another weapon has entered the war: hunger. In 2025, as of today, actually, Sudan is now on the brink of what the UN classifies as a level 5 famine, the highest category possible. That means catastrophic conditions. When people start dying not from bullets but from starvation. Over 24 million people, almost half the population, face acute hunger. Entire regions, especially North Darfur, have been declared famine zones. And it's not because there's no food, it's because aid can't reach the people who need it. Both sides, the SAF, the RSF, have been accused of blocking humanitarian convoys, looting warehouses, and using starvation as leverage. The RSF in particular has been linked to obstruction and famine hit Darfur, while the SAF restricts aid access in areas it doesn't control. So civilians are trapped between hunger and gunfire. Mothers walk miles looking for grain. Children die before help can arrive, and the rest of the world barely blinks. And in all this, women and girls are suffering in ways that rarely makes the headlines. In Darfur, aid groups have documented mass sexual violence, women attacked while fetching water or food, girls assaulted during forced evacuations. Some survivors are as young as 12. Others are silenced out of fear, shame, or retaliation, and the UN calls it a gender emergency. Doctors Without Borders and other NGOs say hundreds of survivors have sought treatment, but countless others can't reach help at all. Women who survive violence face new risks: pregnancy, disease, stigma. In camps with no medical care, no security, no justice. It's the most invisible part of this war, and maybe the hardest to hear, because when you strip away politics, this is what a war really is. It's a brutal test of who gets to be human and who doesn't. As of this year, the RSF has announced its own quote-unquote parallel government, and parts of Darfur it controls, claiming it's building an alternative authority. Meanwhile, the SAF holds Port Sudan and much of the east, functioning as the official government, but struggling to govern at all. Drone strikes, like the ones RSF carried out near Port Sudan, Kassala earlier this year, show how far the battlefield has expanded. Infrastructure is in ruins, bridges down, hospitals gone, communications severed. Reconstruction will take hundreds of billions Sudan does not have. And all through this, foreign powers keep pulling strings. Egypt quietly supports Burhan. The UAE is accused of backing Hemeti's RSF. Russia, Turkey, and others circle for gold, oil, and access. Sudan has become the crossroads of not just Africa, but global interests. And still, people still keep showing up for one another. Okay? That's the human spirit. And that's the Sudan the world doesn't see, the one that refuses to give up. And to you listening, I know sometimes it's hard to talk about Sudan. It feels complicated, and it feels like just it's so far away. You're kind of like, okay, so what can I do? But here's the truth. Now you know. What did I say earlier? Knowledge is power. You've heard how we got here. You understand who's fighting, what's at stake, and who's paying the price. You can't hide behind, I don't know enough to post anymore. That's excuse. That's literally silence. It's what allows things like this to keep happening. You don't have to be Sudanese to care. You just have to care enough to say something. Because when you speak, have a conversation with your friend, your family, you give space to people who have been silenced. And when you stay quiet, the silence sides with the strongest gun. So post about it. Talk about it with your friends. Share stories, art, fundraisers, whatever you can, because every voice that speaks for Sudan becomes part of its survival. You know, after everything we talked about, the kingdoms, colonization, dictatorships, revolutions, and this brutal war, I want to stop for a second and say this. Sudan is still becoming. Not rebuilding, not recovering, becoming. Because this isn't a story with a neat ending. It's a country mid-sentence still trying to finish its thought. And the question is, what will that sentence say? I know a lot of people just say, like, online that they don't feel educated enough to post about Sudan, but that was understandable before, not anymore. What's your excuse? Because if you've listened this far, you know, you understand how Sudan's got here. Who's fighting, who's suffering, who's surviving. So the real question isn't, do I know enough? It's, now that I know, what am I going to do with it? Silence might feel safe, but in a world like ours, silence is a side. When you scroll past the suffering of an entire people and say absolutely nothing, it tells the world that their pain is optional. And Sudanese people do not have that luxury. They've been screaming into a void that refuses to echo back. So yes, post about it. Talk about it in your group chats. Talk about it with your friends, your family. Correct misinformation when you see it. Use your platforms, your conversations, your creativity, because solidarity doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to exist. If this story has taught me anything, Sudan isn't just geography. It's a reflection of all of us. It's beauty and suffering, strength and exhaustion, faith and frustration, all living in the same body. And maybe that's what makes Sudan so human. Every generation inherits a broken system and has to decide, do we fix it or do we normalize it? Sudanese youth, many of them born during war, coming out of age of revolution, are doing what no one taught them how to do. They're imagining a new future from ashes. They're creating schools and displacement camps, documenting war crimes online, organizing aid through encrypted chats. They're proving that hope isn't a feeling, it's a skill. And maybe that's what becoming really means. Not waiting for peace, but building it when the world isn't watching. So if you're listening right now, you are part of that story. You can't unknow what you know. So next time you feel small, remember that empathy is a kind of power. So just use it, okay? Because the world doesn't need change when we learn. It changes when we care enough to act on what we learned. And if there's one thing Sudan teaches us, is that people can survive anything except indifference. So don't be indifferent. Be awake. Be aware and part of the becoming. This was another episode of They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numbe, where we tell the stories they didn't and remind the world that Africa's pain and power are both real, both human, and both worth remembering. Because until we reclaim our stories, the lies keep winning, and we're not letting that happen anymore.